Usual 10-minute intro of a couple of items in the news for us. ABT, ABT time. Boom, boom,
All
boom.
right, we are rolling.
Firing it up. Okay. Um, Alrighty then, let's get going. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the first half of the year. And we're going to take a break starting after today for the whole month of July. We will be away. Um, and we'll come back in early August. By the way, if anybody's got any thoughts on any preferred time slots, this has been Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, and it's worked pretty well. But we've had some people that had middle of the week things that have been blocked for the whole spring and haven't been able to join us. So we're open to suggestions for other time slots, but we're kind of likely to stick somewhere around the middle of the week and middle of the day. But yeah, go ahead and either send an email to Matthew or type it in the chat window of the suggestions. And let's see, today we're going to dive into the law in a big way, but first 10 minutes of my little intro thing. As I say, hiatus returning in August, and this has been just a tremendous experience. I think we've thoroughly enjoyed it. We had hoped when we launched this thing that each week we'd get at least about three or four consistent people and would have a group of five or six each week. We've had pretty much 20 every session and all the way up to 42 when we had our rabble rouser, the climate skeptic Mark Morano. So we'll have more in the second half of the year and working on all kinds of creative ideas for our spotlight guests. Let me begin by talking about natural selection. So, this is the dodo bird. Once upon a time, it lived on the island of Mauritius off of Madagascar, and it lived a happy life there. And things were so comfortable, it didn't even need to fly. And so it evolved into a flightless bird. But then one day, its environment changed. Humans showed up and they decided they liked to eat these things. And had the dodo had the ability to change with the changed environment, it might have had its wings returned to being functional and given it the ability to fly and could have flown away from the predatory humans and would have survived. But it didn't. It failed to change with its environment. And as a result, it went extinct. And that is our little lesson in all this communication stuff. If you do not change with the changing environment, you get selected against, you go extinct. I'm talking to you, Democratic Party, for example. And so some of the groups that we work with are really wonderful in this regard, and they've come to us with exactly that. 4 years ago, the FAA folks, their Aviation Research Center in New Jersey, Atlantic City, New Jersey, they contacted us and said, we've got to do a better job communicating. We know that the world is changing. We know social media has come in and done this sort of stuff. So we set to work with them. And now we're getting to the point with them where they really are one of our model groups of all time. They're so much fun to work with. That in the end of my book, Houston, we have a narrative a decade ago, I laid out this dream vision, which is the idea that we all know that we suffer from narrative deficiency. We can get better through narrative training, story circles training that I laid out in that book, and that eventually morphed into the narrative training, the ABT training we do nowadays. You work on that, you develop narrative intuition. That is the ability to sense narrative structure rather than just having rules memorized. And the dream scenario is an organization in which enough people in the organization have done this sort of training, learned the language of the ABT, that they can speak it and they can begin to apply it on a day-to-day basis. And we've worked with several groups where we felt like we were headed on the pathway there. But this group at FAA, yesterday's session just left me thinking like, wow, we are really starting to get there with them. And we did several rounds of training 3 and 4 years ago with them. So we introduced it with a lot of the people. I went there back in March and did a visit for a couple of days and really kind of lit the fire. And then what we set up then is doing our narrative gym exercise, which we now are doing every single week on the schedule. So we did the first 6 rounds. They were on Wednesdays. Now we moved it to Tuesday. And yesterday we did, I think, about the 10th time we've done one of these narrative gyms. And it's 15 people, 15 to 20 people, all gathered together to work on one person's ABT for the hour. And yesterday, with this goal of establishing narrative culture, so eventually they can do their own working circles independently. At the core of all this is the challenge of trying to find concision. And so let me just say a few things about this idea of trying to find concision, which is to try and boil things down into their essence so that uh, they're shorter in length and more powerful in punch. So yesterday's session, this just hit me at the end of the session. This was so wonderful. 1 hour session. The ABT we worked on at the start of the hour was 142 words, which is pretty standard length for an ABT. We set to work on it, and by the time we got to the last 3 or 4 minutes of the hour, it just hit me like we had taken this whole thing, and here's what we ended up with. At the end, we had 3 words, and that was it. And if you were to judge the whole hour's effort based on quantification of volume alone, it looks like the whole hour was a complete failure. What happened? You went from 142 words, you only ended up with 3 words in the end. Well, the 3 words were this, and one of the guys in the group kind of pinpointed this. We were working on the Dobzhansky last thing, and he said, this all comes down to success, but data. They dream of success. They have all these definitions for what they see as success, but if they don't gather the right data and instill the proper data decision making, database decision making process, evidence-based decision making, then it's all for naught, and they'll never get there. So they've got the success in mind, but they've got to have the right data. And that's their core argument. And that really was at the core of this ABT that we worked on and worked on. And this is the kind of thing that somebody needs deep inside their mind to be able to get into a room and communicate effectively about something. They need to know all the details, but they also need this simple, concise core to it, which then set me to thinking yesterday afternoon afterwards. I mean, it was such a good session. A decade ago, I worked with this crazy man for 3 or 4 months, James Carville, Democratic Party strategist, trying to get the Hillary Clinton campaign to listen to what we had to say about the ABT. We never got there. But he told me lots of great stories of his experiences. And he said one of the things that happens with him, he gets hired by these international corporations. They bring him in, they hand him 30 volumes of all their annual reports or whoever, what, their whole big mission statement. He digests it all and he comes back to them with one paragraph. And then he invoices them, $100,000 or something. And he said he's had some of these groups get angry with him. Basically, where's the beef? You're going to charge us all this money and all you've got to show is one paragraph? Yes, that's what it's about. It is so hard to distill this stuff down. There's this famous quote we cite all the time. It's attributed to Churchill and other people like that. I would have written less, but I didn't have the time. But that's the basic essence as well. It's this intuition, this instinct that we think that you've got to have volume. Volume is impressive, but in fact, it's in concision that you get there. And this guy knew that better than anybody. Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park and tons of movies and books, and created the show ER and on and on and on. Brilliant career. Had a background as a biomedical researcher and left that to go to Hollywood. And in 1975, wrote this short paper that's only 3 pages in the New England Journal of Medicine. I cite it endlessly nowadays. And it was titled Medical Obfuscation. It was a beautiful short essay that basically made the case for, first off, 100 years ago, scientists and doctors communicated with much more clarity and strength than they did by the 1970s. And today, it's that much worse. Communication is a disaster today. It hasn't gotten better, despite all this technology and all the advertising campaigns that come with every company that develops a new technology for communication. Oh my God, this is the panacea. No, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And the sad thing is that his 3 page essay that's so brilliantly written is lost to time. My good friend Michael Backus pointed it out to me about 6 or 7 years ago. I couldn't believe it when I read it. But I think in large part because what I like to say is, had he written an 800-page tome on the need to communicate more concisely, it might still be talked about. But everybody's intuition as well. It was only 3 pages, only a little note, it's not that important. This is part of the faulty programming of the brain when it comes to communication, on and on with this sort of stuff. So it's at the core of so much of what we do. And then the last little thing I want to mention here is what we posted on Monday. And Matthew and Liz have been working with me intensely on this for the past couple weeks. This is a blog post on Substack about this Dr. Jeremy Faust. And here's the essence of the story that we told in this blog post, which is that when you take a look at the narrative index, which is, at the core of so much of what we're talking about now, it's at the core of the Lincoln but Trump book that we just came out with. It's as simple as the Butt-Dan ratio and derived from the ABT. What you see is that very clear patterns. When you look at the 4 different types of editorials written by the New York Times, The editorials on the left there by the editorial board are weak. They're a committee exercise. They don't have as singular and clear of a voice as you get with individuals. The other three forms of editorials they publish are from individuals. And then when you get to individuals from the editorial board, which are, of course, major professionals, and then to their professional opinion columnists, that's people like Maureen Dowd and Thomas Friedman and Nicholas Kristof and all the superstars, David Brooks. Their average goes all the way up to 30. So that's what you get with professionals way up there. That's what you expect from the New York Times. Now let's take a look. The next group over there, Science and Medicine. And these are a bunch of different publications that we looked at their editorials that they feature. And they're way down there. They're down there with that editorial board and all the way down. I mean, the molecular ecology and IUCN, those are actual scientific publications, and they're just not drawing on the power narrative. And so that's what you get down here for Science and Medicine. And there's the tendency to look at this pattern and then say, well, you know what? It's different when you're writing for Science and Medicine. You're writing editorial there. You've got a lot of information you got to convey, and you can't afford to be too aggressive and assertive. You don't want to use the word but that much, yada, yada. You come up with all these explanations to it. But here's the problem. And that's why we titled this article, The Exception That Proves the Rule. And the rule is that anybody can communicate powerfully. And over on the far right is Dr. Jeremy Faust. He's the editor-in-chief for MedPage. That first bar there with the crosshatch, that's their editorial, Second Opinions. I've had 5 that I've published in there. But he's the editor-in-chief, and he works as a doctor in the emergency room at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And when we started looking at his editorials and doing the narrative index, we saw a pattern that we've never seen before, which is kaboom, all the way up there. He averages a 47 and way beyond the New York Times editorials. And when you read his editorials, they're very powerful. And why would he be so good? Well, first off, is he working on matters of life and death? Yes, that's exactly what he works on. He's working in the emergency room all through the pandemic of people dying. So these editorials he writes are very focused, very powerful. And secondly, he's really got the strength of both ends of the spectrum. He's very cerebral, having been Harvard educated, went to Harvard Medical School, yada, yada, yada. And then he's also got the visceral, experiential, practical side, which is that he's a working doctor in the emergency room. So he knows what the real world is like as well. And those two elements combine for very powerful communication. And that's the point of that blog post, is to say, there's your role model right there. And all these other journals ought to look at him and ask themselves, why are you letting these scientists write these wimpy and things that are only being read by people in their own field? And they don't want to hear that. And so 2 of these places, the Aslo thing there, invited me to write an editorial. That's what I gave them for the message, and they rejected it. They said, we're not going to publish this. Same thing happened with MedPage. People don't like to be criticized like that. So, all right, that's our little intro speech for today, where we are with ABT ramblings and rantings. And now today's theme is going to be about the law, and our spotlight guest is one of our team members here for the past few years, Patrick Barone. Our lawyer, Doug Passon, who I co-authored the law version of the narrative Jim, recruited Patrick about 3 years ago, and we did one little workshop with he and a few of his fellow lawyers. We've got Doug here with us as well to contribute. But Patrick has really jumped in deep on the ABT over the last couple of years, and then written this really nice series of articles, of which I think it was the 3rd installment I sent to all of you in the group email when I sent it out. And then he's got this blog post he just did yesterday. The reason your legal arguments fall flat: no ABT, no story, no chance. And so let me stop the sharing here. And Patrick, how's about let me start off the discussion here with a couple of questions, or with just a simple question, which is, tell us the good and the bad. Tell us the good side of ABT. Tell us the frustrating side of trying to be an ABT pioneer in the legal world.
The good side is the way I use it in my practice. When I heard you talking in your intro and you used the word concision, I thought that's what it is. That's what the ABT is for me. And as someone who struggles with being a subject matter expert, as you know, Randy, the problem with being a subject matter expert is you have all this information in your head, and you feel like if you could only convey all this information to the listener, they would understand it the same way you do, and they would have the same viewpoint that you have. They would want to take the same action that you have, that you want to take, etc. And that's really not the way it works. No matter who you're speaking to, whether it's a subject matter expert like a judge or another lawyer, or a layperson like your client, concision is the name of the game. And I have always struggled with being concise, whether I'm making an argument in front of a judge on a motion, I'm arguing for mitigation on a sentencing, arguing in front of a jury, doesn't matter what it is. Concision has always been the biggest struggle for me. And I think as I was listening to you, the light bulb that went off for me is, and you've asked me this question before, Randy, why do some people get it and some people don't? Like you, Patrick, you just learned it and you took off with it and you loved it and you use it. While other people, you give it to them and they're just like, oh, okay, that's nice. And they never look at it again. Like, what's the difference? And I think the difference for me is the way my brain works. I really crave that type of concision, and using the ABT really causes me to have to not just be concise, but to be more well organized and structured.
Okay,
And
let
that's
me
the
let me.
reason why it works so well for me.
All right, let's take a little sidetrack for a moment here on that subject, which is emails. I was just trading with my good buddy Shirley Malcolm yesterday on this very subject, for which I, being the horrible determinist that I am, attribute a lot of that divide there by why do some people get it, some don't. I said my impression is a lot of it's genetics. Shirley didn't like that so much. So Shirley, let's hear your rebuttal to me, the horrible racist or whatever eugenicist.
Yeah,
I
you really,
swear I know all the dangers of that stuff. But let's hear your take on.
well, I come from the school of genetics works with environment, and that in fact, if you are in an environment where that is practiced and valued, that you are more likely to do it, and that it is teachable. If we didn't believe it was teachable, if we believed that everybody just walked in with it or didn't, then we shouldn't be here. All right. And so I believe it's teachable and people can at least get better, and so that's the point I subscribe to.
Anybody want to chime in with other deep-seated thoughts and opinions on that? Doug,
Oh,
do you feel like people have endless potential?
Uh, I have faith in humanity and my fellow brothers and sisters of the law, but I submit that we've talked about this before. It's just that we're taught wrong. The foundation is laid very poorly. So most lawyers are teetering on a very precarious and throw every fact out there and hope that the decision makers figure out the story on their own. We're just never taught. And you know, Patrick got this right away, I think, because his brain works that way. I got it right away, I think, because I've been swimming in story and making little movies since I was a kid, and I just read every book on screenwriting. Like I just knew intuitively, even before I went to law school, about storytelling. Not intuitively necessarily, but I'd done the work. But I think you combine teaching all wrong with that. Now we're 10, 20, 30 years down the road, and I know how to do everything, and
I'm coming. I'm going.
nobody wants to learn anything new.
Okay. Matthew, was there anybody in the chat that wanted
Dean has something. Go ahead.
to?
As usual, sorry.
As usual, Dino.
I think this question of like who it comes to naturally versus like who needs to be beaten over the head with it has, to me, a lot to do with people who tend to introspect or people who don't. And I think about it in terms of I would like to pattern myself after those people that I think of as when person X speaks, I shut up and listen because I know it's going to be to the point and important. And when I think about it, all of those people are people who are concise. None of those people are people who can open their mouth and go nonstop for 27 minutes. That turns out not to be a selling point in that arena. And then it comes back to, oh, and how do I speak? Because I would like to be like those people. And I think people who do it naturally in a sense, I think are being very observant as opposed to people who may be just reacting.
Let me put my good friend Greg Tillman on the spot for a minute here, if you're up for it, Greg. In your many years of developing stories with documentary filmmakers in Hollywood and those sorts of things, surely you've come across some of these people that just instantly can put their finger right to the core of what the story is versus other people who ramble on and on and on. Greg, you got thoughts and experience on that dynamic?
Well, that's certainly true, but the reason I turned on my video was because I just thought the talk about, lawyers are trained, it seems like, to give lots of information to back up things that they're trying to do with, tons of and thing. And then when you come in and say, we need to make things more concise, there's a either or quality to that. Like, you're going to take away all of my pages of documentation and make me just say things in very tight ABTs. But it seems like you can do both, right? You can say to a judge, listen, here's all of the information that we have, but let me tell you what this is really about and give someone a very clear, concise ABT that explains what they're trying to get across, but you can do both, right?
Yeah. Okay. Let me toss out one anecdote because the power of storytelling rests in the specifics, and so the best way to communicate on a lot of this stuff is to try and tell some specific instances. And most of you have heard me tell this story before, but it just really needs to be tossed out again in the middle of all this because having seen a moment of concision that sticks with you for the rest of the time, and if Rick Nelson were here, he would tell this story as well. He and I, way back at the beginning, ran a demo day for story circles with the fish and wildlife folks at University of Wisconsin. And we ended the day with an exercise where every table of 5 people came up with the one ABT to share with the group. And we went through 4 or 5 tables sharing their one ABT they were most proud of. And they were all really good, heavily informational. Everybody was nodding along. Oh, wow, that's really, really good. And then, like the fourth or fifth table we got to, this woman stood up and she said, we've been using fish weirs to catch fish out in these little canals for over a century, and they do work, but they suck. And those 3 words, but they suck, caused the room to explode with laughter that went on for minutes of people just screaming and howling. And there was concision. The trade-off of didn't have every single detail about this dynamic of these fish weirs. It just captured the essence of it powerfully. And this is the problem we deal with a lot of people is the divide between information and research, which, when you're writing your research annals or whatever, yeah, you would need to have all the data in there. But we're talking about communication here. And again, that's effective communication. You have an overall bar that just tells you how well did you communicate. And in that moment, really powerful. Matthew, anybody else before we get back to give the floor back to Patrick? Yeah,
Uh,
sure, Shirley. Yes.
Yeah, I have one. Um, I was basically testifying before Congress. I was on the science board at the time, and we had reached a decision on the board that a lot of people didn't like because their constituents lost grants and what have you. And because everybody had a conflict of interest, so to speak, it was only a handful of people that ended up having to vote for this thing. So they smelled that there was a problem. And I said, while only the executive committee voted for it, I said, the executive committee voted for it. I said, but every member of the board had 7 inches of paper to get through about how we reached the decision. That shut down everybody because they could not say that we had not gone through everything that everybody did not have access to everything that they needed in order to contribute to that decision. The conflicts and stuff like that were irrelevant they had to be adhered to. But on the other hand, everybody had the information. Bah. And that was that. And then I said that if there was any more questions, I would be more than happy to address them. At which point Adam Schiff said, I bet you would.
That's great. Yeah, the sheer enormity of that amount of information, it just it turns into responsibility elements, it seems like. Patrick, let's see. You talk about Well, first off, tell us about your entry into ABT land because Doug first brought you along, and I don't recall in the beginning you catching fire. It seemed like it took a little bit of time. I remember we did a thing with your law firm. I think we did a little 1 hour exercise, and that didn't really light much of a fire. What was your progression like? Did you have what we like to call a Liz moment, a single day where you use the ABT in something and started to feel like, oh wow, I get it?
I can't think of a single day or a single event. I know that when Doug originally introduced me to it, I found great power in it. Like Doug, I had been studying story and different types of storytelling and narrative formats for many years, but most of them are very complicated, like the hero's journey, for example. How many steps are involved? It depends on what resource you look at.
All right. Okay. Hang on. I'm not going to let you get away with this because the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. I'm going to push you harder. Come on. There had to have been one day where you called up Doug or something like that or sent him an email and said, hey, I just used this thing for something. And
Patrick, Randy picks on everyone like
yeah,
this, so don't feel bad.
this is
This
the
is very
standard.
common.
Yeah, this is it. Sometimes it's retrieve memories. But think, dig. Tell us one day that you had a good experience with it. There had to have been something you used it for in the beginning. Maybe
Oh,
Doug can remember first time he heard from
okay.
you. Yes,
I had, I guess,
here we
to
go.
tell a success story.
Here we go.
I had already fallen in love with it. I guess that's the problem in my mind is, okay, when did I fall in love with it versus when did I have great success with it? Those are two different things. The first time I had great success with it was when I was walking into court thinking I would lose the motion that I was about to argue for sure, but
What was the motion? Hang on, give us a few more details.
it was a motion to modify a client's bond conditions when, in my view, the client, if I was the judge, I would have had some trouble modifying, granting the relief that I wanted. But I was able to structure the argument in such a way, being concise enough and using the right format, that I found the judge to be very receptive and gave me the relief that I wanted. I've done the same thing with sentencing in particular. I had a whole string of cases where I was able to obtain what I thought were just remarkably great sentences on behalf of my clients using the ABT format as part of my sentencing mitigation, which I learned from Doug. Doug was the one who introduced me to it, and I brought him in to help me with mitigation. And it was in that backdrop that I first learned about and fell in love with ABT.
Okay, so just to add a little more context to the next question I'm going to ask you. I told about that blog post we did on Monday with Jeremy Faust, and the hilarious thing that happened, as expected, we posted it out there. Matthew put it on to Twitter, X, and Blue Sky, and everything else like that. Within an hour, he picked it up. I didn't send it to him. I don't know him, but we have his name at the beginning of the post, and he began propagating it all through LinkedIn and everything else within an hour. And Matthew could see that happening, all which was great. And then there've been a few comments traded back and forth, but so far as much as we can tell, he's glanced at it and said, "Oh God, somebody gave me praise. This is awesome." We've yet to see any evidence that he really understands what the ABT is, what the narrative index is, that it's really sinking into a deeper level about, wow, this is a really powerful metric. And I still feel like I'm at the point where I've got about a dozen people who really have broken through to grasp why this metric is important and powerful. And it just takes forever to get people to truly digest it. But when they do, when they hit that tipping point, like, oh, I get it now. And we get that a lot with people cheering about the ABT. Oh my God, it's great, it's wonderful. And then I start working with them and I realize they don't really even understand what it is. A number of the major organizations, the key proponent that's brought us in has been a cheerleader for ABT. And then we get in the middle of the training and we realize that they're enthusiastic about it. They don't really understand what it is, how it works. What's going on with your articles that you've published now? Are you getting any feedback? And do you get any sense when people rave to you about this was really a great article that they actually have read it and digested it?
I have not gotten a lot of feedback on that article yet. And I guess the gauge that I would want to use for that is if people read that and then want to have me come and speak to an organization about it, because that means that they have found enough value in it that they want to teach other lawyers about it based on their belief in the ABT itself. And I've been trying to get in front of some organizations that I think would find great value in it, and I haven't had success. Why that's true, I don't know. I think Greg put his finger on it. I think you did too, Randy, when you were talking about your story with Carville. It's like people sort of judge your value by, the number of words that you use or the volume of how long your brief is or whatever. And that's just the wrong metric. You can't determine if someone's being persuasive based on the volume. You have to actually understand from the way that you're receiving their communication as to whether or not it's being persuasive.
But if you don't understand what they're talking about, you're left with only that really as a means of assessment. You can't if you're not grasping the qualitative side, I think you're forced to defer to the quantitative. Wow, that was a lot of stuff. I think that goes on a lot with people. It's just
Well,
not
I
knowing.
think, and I'm sure Doug would agree with this. Lawyers who either don't have the time or don't have the subject matter depth will often substitute volume for that.
Yeah,
So
right.
rather than actually taking the time to learn it, they
Yep.
figure I'm just going to deluge the fact finder, whether it's the judge or the jury, whoever it may be, with all of these facts and let them sort it out. And
Man,
that's just
you know what?
lazy.
I can tell you the same thing in my years as a professor, and I'm sure a lot of people in this group could probably agree with the same thing, which I remember the introductory ecology course that I taught for like 5 years at University of New Hampshire. The first year I taught it, I'd get questions and I would do exactly that. I wasn't sure the answer, so I would dump out a whole bunch of information. Well, there's this and this and this and this. I'd go into end mode, and the poor student would shut up and I would feel better. But I'd sit there thinking to myself, I don't really know what the answer is. I'm just going to try and swamp this. And then in later years, I'm positive I got better where I could answer it with it's this and this, but this, therefore it's this, and boom. But that does take time and just familiarity with it. Julie Clausen, are you there? Always.
She's in the car, last I knew.
Oh, in the car. Can you talk from the
I'm
car? There you are.
She's not in the car. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So how about if you weigh in on this basic dynamic? What if we were to call this sort of the emotional versus the intellectual divide? There's a ton of people, like I'm saying, that bring us into organizations with the emotional element. Oh my God, the ABT is incredible. And then you come to realize they don't, on the intellectual side, they don't really understand what it is and how it works. And bless their hearts for being so enthusiastic about it. But after a while, it is a little disillusioning. Like we're here, the very person that's the big proponent can't explain it themselves. Have you bumped into that at all with all the groups that you've worked with? Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah. So I've come to see it as a threshold that, and you've worked with a lot of our students. They've gone through the courses, and then we continue to work with them using the ABT as a foundation for all the other things we do. And there's definitely an appreciation and an understanding of the power of the ABT. They get that. They get that it is, that clear, concise, and they get the form. But there's a threshold between getting it and being able to use it. And some people, as you know, some people get it quicker than others. And then it's just practice. And at least for the scientific community, we're so used to thinking in a certain way that it's breaking down all of those typical ways that we want to present information, and it's a whole new way. So, it's just the gym analogy, right? You start going to the gym, it's hard work, right? It's really hard to sit and think, and as you said, it's earlier. I would have written it shorter, but I didn't have the time. So you just have to keep pushing and working and pushing.
Okay. So, and speaking of pushing, let me push you then for the next level. Can you think of, without even mentioning any names, any of your people that you've seen follow the arc of getting better at this stuff, breakthrough moments, anything like that to share with us where you hit a moment where you realize somebody's really getting it?
Oh yes, because we work with them every month. And so, we give them a task. We say, okay, put together a 2-minute video using the ABT. And then we break it all down, and they just get incrementally better.
But
and then,
anybody specific you can think of that you remember how bad they were at the start? And, that's what.
Yeah, for sure. Like I can think of 20 of them.
Can you tell us one of them?
Well, I'll give you a story of one that was late career. He's a late career scientist. He
Yes.
signed up for this program. You know, he was as and as big complicated graph guy as it could get. And kudos to him. He came and he goes, I understand there's a better way to communicate my science. You know, teach me how. But he just kept gravitating back to, and we just kept pulling him and showing him and pulling him. And by the end, was he excellent? No. Was he, 60% better? Absolutely yes.
Yeah, I think one of the steps along the way is the development of sensitivity, first off, for the three words and but and therefore. People begin to report back to me. I'm starting to hear the word but when I'm listening to people saying that. And then I think the next step after that is the beginning of the feel for how to set these things up. I mean, it really is a progression bit by bit, and people have these breakthroughs as they get there. So Patrick, back to you in terms of how many converts have you made to the ABT in your law firm and elsewhere?
So before I answer that question, I just wanted, this just came to me when I was listening to Julie speak. I think the question is, do you want to be pedantic or do you want to be persuasive? Those are like the two choices.
Oh, that's great. That's really,
yeah, it just came to me, and I think I'm
oh
going
my
to use
goodness.
that.
Matthew, can you make a note of that for future reference? That's something we should, yes, that's a really
it's a good marketing,
yeah.
right, isn't it? So I'm going to use that myself when I try to sell it to other people. That's really what it boils down to.
What if somebody starts to argue back with you? I want to be pedantic.
well, it's like, well, I don't think that's going to happen. Fine, be pedantic. You're not going to be persuasive. So I have two partners. My one partner has definitely taken up the ABT, and there's an organization that he's the head of, and he taught an ABT course there. There's another lawyer that I'm having more reluctance with, and there's one of my employees. I'm really trying to get him to use it in his business communications, and it's been somewhat of a struggle. He's resistant to it, but he is starting to, I think, understand its power. As far as the organizations are concerned, I think that the pushback that I keep getting really is, oh, I already know storytelling. I do it this way. And they have a model in their mind that they've already been taught at some point, and they don't see that this is really any better. And I guess maybe that's me not being, persuasive enough in the way that I'm communicating it to them, or maybe there is some kind of
the one thing I can say along those lines is, and my group is hearing me talk about this endlessly nowadays. We are a media-driven society, and until the media validates something, it's still everybody's nervous about doing it. And sadly, that is the way that it works. And any day now, some journalists could finally figure out the ABT and see that it's hitting a tipping point. In this blog post I did on Monday, I have a whole paragraph in there linking to all these things in these different professions now, to your stuff in law, to Park stuff in business, to on and on, the stuff in the medical world. There's a big group at MIT that's got a really nice website there for civil engineering using the ABT in there. There's lots and lots of groups that are doing this. And someday a journalist will come along, and maybe from a major venue, and look at all that and say, oh, there's a story here finally. It's been 15 years of pounding away and 15 years of being ridiculed by many academics telling me that, this is your hobby horse you won't let go of. And no, it's different. It just takes time to get there. But when that day happens, and when there's an article in the New York Times about this ABT framework that is really powerful and being used in these different places, that's the day when you can send that to these people. I mean, already at a lower level, the TED Med talk I gave in 2013 ended up being really important with a lot of universities and places like that booked me. They said, the only way we can convince people here to put up the funds to bring you here is by showing them the TED Med brand. I mean, Park can tell you all about that. Everybody's media driven, brand driven. And until you've got that brand endorsing you, everybody's terrified. Well, this looks like something for weirdos to use. So I think that's a lot of the journey. Don't you feel like that, Patrick? You don't have the giant thing you can point to yet.
Well, I would like to think that would be me, Randy, but apparently it's not.
Exactly. That's what you're working on. You're going to be someday. Everybody, this is when.
Well, but seriously, I mean, it's how much influence does the person who's pitching it have in the community that they're pitching it to, and that's definitely a part of it. I still think, at least in law, that there's a big pushback. And some of the reasons why we've already touched on, which is lawyers are pre-programmed to think in a particular way and to structure their arguments in a specific way. And it goes back to law school. We're and you know this, Randy, we're taught what's called the IRAC method. That's how we're supposed to think through it's how we're supposed to brief our cases when we're studying. That's how we're supposed to recite them back to the professor if we get cold called. That's how our exams are supposed to be structured. So we think all through law school. That's
And
the
that
way
stands for
lawyers do
what?
it.
That stands for what?
Issue, you basically you state what the issue of the case is or that's being decided is. What's the applicable rule, the rule of law that applies? What's the analysis? So now you have to apply the law to the facts or to the rule. And then what's the conclusion? So it's issue, rule, analysis, conclusion.
And that's just ABT. It's the same thing, agreement, the whole context setup. The contradiction is the rule being applied to it, I guess. Or what was the third element there?
Issue, rule, analysis,
Yeah,
conclusion.
the analysis is the contradiction, and then the last element is see, that's what happened in that thing on that LinkedIn guy's analysis of the 6 CEO models for storytelling, and they're all just the tripartite structure. I mean, we've known this for hundreds of years, but everybody's got their own brand, and they've added things that complicate it. But I think at the core, what you've talked about there's 4 elements there, but the first 2 are both setup elements, I think. Does that make sense to you?
It does. The issue, I suppose, would be the butt material, because that's the problem that you're trying to solve. That's the
That's the
issue.
analysis, isn't it? The analysis
Yeah.
gets you. But when we analyze this thing, here's what we see.
Yes. So
No, I think Patrick, you're right. The issue is the problem.
Yeah, that's
What
the
is the
problem.
issue that we're trying to resolve here? And so you see how flawed that system is if you look at it through that lens, because we're never starting with we shouldn't be starting with the problem.
Yeah, and the analysis really, if I'm thinking about it, the analysis would really be the and material, ironically, because the and material is the perfect world. So you're in the analysis, you want to talk about why the conclusion is the right conclusion. So you're going to talk about public policy. You're going to talk about why it's the right way to apply the law to the problem, etc. So I guess the elements are there. They're in a different order, and it's not structured in the most powerful way. That's the way I would summarize it.
And the most powerful way to structure anything and everything is simply expected versus observed. And that's the way we work best. Is expected is the way the status quo, what the world is of today, and then the observed. And I kind of think what you're talking about there sounds to me like expected versus observed. I think those first 2 elements are here's the issue, here's what we expect, here's what we've seen, and the observed is the analysis. But when we analyze this thing, here's what we see. Therefore, that's the way it hits me for those elements.
Yeah,
Well,
I
here's what I think the problem is. I think we're both kind of right in the sense that if we were taught right to frame the issue in a way that more mirrors the and sort of structure, then it would be persuasive writing. But nobody's teaching the lawyer how to do that. They're going to say the issue is whether the person's confession was coerced. And that's what you're going to say. The issue here is whether the person's confession is coerced. And then the rule is confessions are coerced when the police overcome your will by blah, 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 this, and this. And then in this case, the police did this, and this. Therefore, the confession was coerced. And you see how that just becomes fucking mind numbing. And but we're never taught, we could be taught to take that framework and then conform it to an ABT, more of an ABT narrative, and be so much more persuasive and compelling. But I think that's the missing link in our teaching.
A little sidetrack here for a minute or two, going back to Greg. Are you still there? And Greg and I talk endlessly about the narrative structure of especially documentaries and especially places like Netflix. Have you by any chance seen this new documentary in the last few days that's on there about the apartment building in London that burned down and the 78 people who burned to death in it? It just came on a few days ago on Netflix, and I watched the first hour of it until I couldn't take any more. And it's just mind-numbing, the extent to which they don't know what narrative structure is or they just don't care, because in this story they had all this horrific footage of people in the windows of this burning building. They're up there on the eighth or ninth floor and couldn't get out. And it's just horrible looking at that footage. And they just keep coming back to it as a means of pulling your eyeballs back into the thing. They just, it's not structured at all, doesn't have a setup, doesn't have a problem statement. There's no theme, nothing to it. It's just a whole bunch of reporting on this building that burned up and the faulty design. But it's just, there's no linear timeline to it. It's jumping all over the place. And after a while, it looked to me like every time the thing starts to stall out, they just cut back to people in a window screaming and yelling and burning up. And every time you see that, like, oh my God, oh my God. Have you seen that one, Greg?
No, and I'm not going to now.
I couldn't take it after an hour. It wasn't going anywhere as a story. It was just this. And the question that begs then, is this just second screen programming where they just don't want to tell enough of a story that it interrupts your TikTok scrolling or something like that? But these things are changing and it's very bizarre. And when you get this basic 3-act structure model in your mind, and then you start looking at what's going on now in this programming, it's being increasingly documented that the audience has changed its attention span, and Hollywood's just catering to that and saying this is what it looks like you want. What's
but there are still things that cut through that are done by people who either because they've been trained or because they just have a good instinct towards ABT. There's a lot of material, but they're still developing kind of a cycle of escalating ABTs, and there's an overarching ABT, and those things cut through, and I think are the things that people really wind up talking about.
And speaking of that, have you seen the one on Titanic, the Titan, the submersible that imploded? That also just came up in the last few days. And to your point there, that one is really good. At least, I hate to not to spoil anything, but I thought the last third wasn't quite as great. But man, by halfway through, it's exactly that. It's riveting. It's very powerful, and they've done a good job. But then again, it didn't seem like it had the whole journey down. But Patrick, we're in the last 10 minutes here. What do you got in mind for future ABT propagation efforts since you're doing such a good job with this stuff right now, this blog post?
Well, I'm going to continue to write about it, and I'm going to continue to try to solicit speaker engagements in front of different organizations so that I can continue to try to teach lawyers this, because I feel very strongly about it. And I think that it's going to improve everyone's ability to be persuasive rather than pedantic.
Yeah, I know two good speakers to recommend to you. One is my friend Doug Passon, and then he's got a buddy named Randy Olson. And I think you might be able to talk both those guys someday. Doug, do we want to try and someday do a seminar or something like that with your lawyers? I'd love to. I mean, it's always really interesting for us to run this stuff by different demographics like that. So keep that in mind.
Yes. Yes. And I will say that the work, when we have tried this, your input, we are so in the weeds, Patrick and I, that it's really is valuable to have an outer circle person to just boil this down,
Well, and
it's hard. It's really hard.
On that note, how important are outer circle people, Matthew, in all of our training stuff? It's just that's a lot of that's what you're up against. Is this again this pre-programmed intuition, the belief? It's what I ran into 15 years ago, the first visit I did to CDC. Last week, we had Glenn Novak, who was the communications director at CDC, that brought me there in 2010. And their communications people said this to me, that most of our scientists don't want to talk to a communications person unless they know the inner circle material of our field. If we're doing research on molecular biology, we want them to know all the basics of how the field works, and you can't do it. The ones that to get that, we work with a lot of people that have come from the science world with their huge science background and then tried to learn communication, and they work hard, but it's not the same as people. It's just getting that. It's so counterintuitive that you.
I have a new catchphrase that I stole from Scott Galloway. I don't know if you're a Scott Galloway fan, but it sums this up very well for me, which is it's very hard to read the label from inside the bottle.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty right on.
Good one. That is great.
Dropping gems today, you guys. Wow.
That one is really good.
Can
Yeah.
I ask my legal colleagues here?
Yes, please.
Essentially, I feel as though somebody needs to be going after legal education because
Yeah,
that is where they are getting indoctrinated to these particular
100%.
styles. And I think that to a certain extent, I wish, for example, that there were a way of letting a student essentially walk through a number of Supreme Court decisions, the ones that establish something all the way to the ones that finally tear it down. Okay. For example, to go from Plessy to Brown.
Mm.
And there are lots of things that are in between. These are cases that had to be mounted to overcome total craziness in Plessy v. Ferguson, which is essentially the most racist thing ever. But the point is, there is a whole series of cases that said, you say this, but we say that, and you basically tear down one part of the argument. Then another
Mhm.
case tears down another part of the argument.
Oh,
Then
that's really
another,
interesting.
hmm?
That's really interesting. That's great. You're talking about nested ABTs basically.
Yeah,
With
I
the
mean, it tears
overarching
down
journey.
another part of the argument. And
Wow.
many of those cases that started to tear down the pieces were basically argued by Thurgood Marshall and
Mm.
the NAACP legal team. And they had set up a strategy to tear down different pieces that of the argument so that they could get to the point where they could overturn it.
Wow. Patrick, what do you think of that?
I think it's awesome. And it just goes to show the power of having people who are outside the bottle talk to the people of us who are inside the bottle and give us some good ideas. Uh,
We have just rebranded our inner circle, outer circle diagram as from this moment forward, inside the bottle versus outside the bottle. That is that's brilliant.
but you asked me, Randy, earlier on about challenges that I have, and I don't think you meant so much challenges that I have personally working with the ABT, but that was where my mind went. And one of the challenges that I have is with the whole concept of nested ABTs. I'm usually good, or like I'm getting good at coming up with the ABT that applies the overarching ABT, but then breaking that down into smaller pieces and putting each of those pieces into the ABT is where the biggest challenge is for me. And I had never thought about doing that over a series of issues, over a series of cases, over a series of time, the way that Shirley just recommended, which is very profound. And I like that very much. Um,
And Doug, what are your thoughts on what Shirley just suggested there?
Oh, 100%. We got to get them when they're young, but this is the same problem we're going to be running up against. These and law professors are worse than lawyers because they just you're basically going to say, "Hey, you've been doing this all wrong for 100+ years. Now you want to do this right." So, but if we could create a curriculum that's based on ABT, and then what Shirley's saying, Shirley, is there like a book or something that talks about the strategy of the NAACP and the certain element? Like, if you
I
could
will
get that
I
laid
will
out
try
and
to
build a
find because
curriculum.
I have been very much interested in the process by which these things got torn down.
Yeah,
And I let me see what I can
Well,
find.
I mean,
okay, this is what a perfect wrap up to our first 6 months of this discussion group, which is next
mhm.
month. There's nothing on the schedule, but I'm gonna work on the concept of just the four of us as a core group to see if we can do a couple of discussions of test this hypothesis that Shirley's just presented, which is the possibility that this could be the iconic case study of nested ABTs. What a great group of material there. And what if we took a look more closely at what she's saying? Would we spot several of these sub ABTs that have taken place along the way of the overarching journey of ABT? Which that's really really great because this goes on and on. Uh, the we constantly I talk about Oprah Winfrey's Golden Globe speech in 2018 that the next day the New York Times, just everybody raved about it. Oh my God, that's a masterpiece overnight. Well, it was the same ABT as Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, which is basically we're on a journey and we've made some progress, but we're not there yet. Therefore, we've got a lot more work to do. And there's your overarching ABT, inside of which are all these sub ABTs. And that was what Oprah's speech was made up of. And that's why the New York Times referred to it as a story made of stories, which, I looked at and I constantly tell people I wish I'd thought of that when I was writing the Houston book, because I labeled it the nerdy nested ABT structure. They call it a story built of stories, but that's what it is. And what if, as Shirley has suggested here, this journey from, as you say, from Plessy to Brown versus Board of Education, what if that really does give you a good, simple, agreed upon starting and not end point, but a journey there, which you can then see if you can spot several steps along the way. I love that whole idea. So let's pursue that. Nobody
And
else is going to do that.
the beauty of it is that one of the cases was, I guess it's Sweat or Sweet v. Painter, which was the black guy couldn't go to the law school in Texas, but Plessy said separate but equal, but they didn't have a law school for blacks. So you had to basically either set up a law school or let him go to the law school at Austin. So it basically just tore down the pieces over time.
Amazing. Okay. Well, I knew that it couldn't be as simple as just doing nothing for the month of July. Therefore, this general discussion group with the spotlight guests will resume the first week of August. But in the meanwhile, I'm going to push for the four of us to be the nucleus, Patrick, Doug, Shirley, and myself. And then we'll announce it to everybody else. Welcome to tune in. But we'll see if in the month of July, we can do 2 or 3 little sessions of brainstorming on this and digging into it. Does that sound like fun, Patrick?
It does. And I'm wondering if some of those arguments that were made are actually still something that we could obtain as part of the record.
Yeah. Okay. We'll start in the week after 4th of July. I'll push for our first little session. We'll find time works for the four of us. Everybody else, see if they can tune in. We'll record them. People can watch them. All of which means that this final hour here before our hiatus ends up with a very clear therefore. Therefore, thank you, Shirley. We're going to do a little journey through the month of July and see what that leads to. That's perfect. So awesome. Okay. And on that note, we shall hereby proclaim break time and see you all again sometime soon. We'll keep you posted.
See you in August, gang.